My dissertation is on interethnic romance in Jewish American fiction in the turn of the 20th century. And okay, so when I started studying Yiddish literature, the summer that I was in the Yiddish Book Center, I was an English major, and I was taking a lot of classes in African American literature. That was like my focus. I was almost an African American studies minor. I was one class away from it. And while I was studying African American studies, I had this amazing professor, Lisa Wolfork, who I am not in touch with anymore, who was just the best mentor an undergraduate could ever have. And she taught me a class called Fictions of Black Identity, which was about very contemporary novels where African Americans were kind of like questioning the construct of racial identity and kind of poking around the edges of it and exposing its fictions, as it were. And a number of the novels were about African Americans thinking about Jewishness or passing as Jews as a way of thinking about what race in America is. And I became very interested in that question. And that was kind of what drew me into studying Jewish literature in the first place. I was studying African American literature, and I kept writing about Jews and realizing that actually what I wanted to be studying was Jewish American literature. So it was kind of a roundabout way to get there, but there I was. So when I applied to Columbia, I wanted to write about race, Jews and race in Yiddish literature. And I found that the topic was just too big, and I didn't know where to start or how to approach it. I was writing my dissertation prospectus in like this pool of utter despair about where to even begin, and I don't know, this like imposter syndrome about the enormity of the topic and my inability to do anything with it. And at the same time, my husband, who was in rabbinical school, was writing his senior sermon, which is like their big and kind of one of their big capstone projects. You give this like big sermon that's supposed to kind of like say something important about what you want to do with your rabbinate, I think, in some way. And he was writing a sermon about HUC, which is his rabbinical school's policy not to accept or ordain students who are with non-Jewish partners. He was against that policy. And we had all of these conversations about what that policy meant and what intermarriage means in a kind of theoretical way about Jews as a race, Jews as a religion, and what the borders and boundaries of Jewishness are, and how we think about them and what kind of like symbolic value we place on the idea of intermarriage. So we never like had there's no one big conclusion, but I think one of the major things that came out of it was our feeling that the stigma around intermarriage comes from a Jewish feeling that Jewishness is not just a religious thing, but a racial thing. And also a discomfort with articulating that because of the history of how the idea of Jews as a race has been employed. And so somehow this converges around the idea of intermarriage. So we had been talking about this over and over again as he was writing his senior sermon. And at the same time, I was like in this quagmire of dissertation prospectus land. And finally, I was like, you know what I need to do is write my dissertation about this question. Because if what I want to talk about is Jews and race, what better way to do it than to poke at this fictions of Jewish identity, if you will, through the question of intermarriage. And that's where I am.